Every empire has a fracture line, not in its walls or its armies, but in the single moment its ruler discovers that absolute control was always an illusion. Duke Kaelin Ashbourne governed Blackthorn for 19 years without ever learning that lesson. Tonight, standing in a candlelit corridor while his wife's signature dried on a dissolution decree, he would begin to understand exactly how much territory a man can lose without surrendering a single acre. Stay until the last word. What happens inside this castle will outlast every stone that built it. The morning began with precision, as every morning inside Blackthorn Castle had begun for nearly 2 decades. Kaelin Ashbourne descended the northern staircase at exactly 6 minutes past dawn. His boots struck limestone in a rhythm so consistent that the kitchen staff synchronized their bread timers to it. 3 floors below, the head baker would hear that 5th step land on the landing stone, sharp and final as a gavel, and slide the first tray into the oven without checking any clock. He wore black. He always wore black. Not for mourning, not for ceremony, but because black absorbed attention rather than competing for it. Lesser men dressed to be noticed. Kaelin dressed to remind every room he entered that its center of gravity had just shifted. The great hall stretched before him like a cathedral of ambition. 64 feet of vaulted ceiling supported by columns older than any surviving dynasty on the continent. Banners hung from iron brackets forged before anyone alive could remember who had commissioned them. Morning light crept through narrow windows set deep into walls thick enough to stop cannon fire, casting sharp geometric patterns across a floor that had witnessed 300 years of political calculation, strategic marriages, and the quiet disposal of anyone foolish enough to mistake the Duke's patience for weakness. Kaelin walked its length without looking up. He had memorized every shadow this hall could produce in every season. Architecture did not impress him. Architecture obeyed him. His steward, Garrick Mond, waited beside the eastern hearth, with a leather folio pressed against his chest like armor. Garrick had served Blackthorn for 31 years, longer than Kaelin had held the title. He was the only man in the duchy permitted to speak before being addressed, a privilege he had earned not through loyalty, but through the far rarer quality of being consistently useful. 3 items require your attention before the Privy Assembly convenes, Garrick said, falling into step 2 paces behind as Kaelin passed without slowing. 2. Your Grace? Whatever the 3rd item is, you hesitated before counting it. That means it involves sentiment. Sentiment is not an item. Give me the first 2. Garrick opened the folio without breaking stride. Lord Pemberton's delegation has formally requested an audience regarding tariff adjustments on northern grain shipments. They are citing crop failures along the Ashenmere Valley as justification for a temporary reduction. Pemberton's crops failed because Pemberton spent his irrigation budget on a hunting lodge. Deny the audience. Send a surveyor to assess the actual damage. If the surveyor confirms genuine hardship among his tenants, we will bypass Pemberton entirely and distribute grain reserves to the villages. Pemberton himself receives nothing. And the second? Tell me. Minister Aldrich Voss has submitted a formal petition to restructure the Privy Assembly's voting procedures. He proposes weighted representation based on territorial holdings rather than hereditary rank. Kaelin stopped walking. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds, but within those 4 seconds, Garrick felt the temperature of the corridor drop by a measurable degree. He had served under Kaelin's father before Kaelin, and the old Duke had been a shouter, a table pounder, a man whose anger arrived with theatrical warning. His son had inherited none of that generosity. Kaelin's displeasure arrived like ice forming beneath a bridge. By the time you noticed it, the structural damage was already done. Voss wants to restructure my assembly, Kaelin said, pronouncing the possessive with surgical emphasis, so that men who own the most land hold the most votes. That is the substance of his petition, yes. But about some. And Voss recently acquired 6,000 additional acres through his marriage to the Hargrove widow. 7,000, Your Grace. The eastern parcels were reassessed. So Aldrich Voss, who could not win an argument against me through intelligence, now proposes changing the rules of the game so that acreage argues for him. Kaelin resumed walking. Deny the petition. And Garrick, ensure Voss receives my denial while he is dining with other ministers, publicly. Let him understand that ambition disguised as reform still smells like ambition. Very good, Your Grace. Garrick paused. And the third matter? I said two. Her Grace has requested stationery. Kaelin's stride did not falter. His expression did not shift. His hands remained exactly where they had been, one resting against the pommel of the ceremonial blade he wore at his left hip, the other hanging loose at his side. Nothing visible changed. But Garrick had spent 3 decades reading the silences of powerful men, and in that fraction of a second between the word stationary and the Duke's next footfall, he detected something he had never once observed in Kaelin Ashbourne: uncertainty. What kind of stationery? Kaelin asked, as though the question were about inventory. Personal correspondence paper, heavy stock, with the Ashbourne seal but also bearing the Vale family crest. He said nothing for 12 steps. Garrick counted. Provide it, Kaelin said finally. Is that all? That is all, Your Grace. Kaelin turned left toward the Privy Assembly chamber without another word, and Garrick watched him disappear around the corner with the quiet certainty that the third item was going to become the only item that mattered. The Duchess of Blackthorn occupied the Eastern Tower suite, 3 floors above the main hall, and precisely as far from the Duke's personal quarters as architectural geometry allowed while remaining inside the same fortress. This was not accidental. Seraphine Vale had requested the Eastern rooms on the 2nd day of her marriage, citing the morning light. Kaelin had granted the request without discussion. He understood light. He also understood distance. 18 months ago, their union had been the most strategically significant marriage contract executed in Blackthorn's modern history. The Vale family controlled the only navigable river passage connecting the duchy's interior provinces to the coastal trade ports. Without that passage, Blackthorn's commercial power depended on overland routes that could be taxed, raided, or simply closed by hostile neighbors. With it, Kaelin's economic dominance became geographic fact. Seraphine had understood the arithmetic. She was 26 years old, educated in 3 languages, trained in estate management by her father since childhood, and fully aware that she was being traded for strategic advantage. She had accepted the terms without protest, not because she lacked the intelligence to object, but because she possessed enough intelligence to recognize that objecting would change nothing and cost everything. What she had not anticipated was the specific quality of Kaelin's indifference. He was not cruel. Cruelty required emotional investment, and Kaelin invested nothing in their marriage that did not yield strategic returns. He was polite at formal dinners. He acknowledged her presence at court functions with exactly the correct degree of public attention. He ensured she received every material comfort the duchy could provide, from hand-tailored gowns to a private library stocked with whatever volume she requested. He simply never once treated her as a person whose inner life warranted curiosity. She existed in his world the way a masterwork portrait existed in his gallery. Valuable, well-maintained, positioned for maximum effect, and utterly silent unless someone chose to look closely enough to wonder what the artist had intended. On this particular morning, Seraphine sat at her writing desk with the newly delivered stationery spread before her. The paper was flawless, cream-colored, thick enough to absorb ink without bleeding. The Ashbourne crest occupied the upper left corner in embossed gold. The Vale crest, her family's mark, sat below it. Smaller, subordinate. She ran one finger across the Vale crest and felt nothing. That absence of feeling was itself the answer she had been waiting 18 months to receive. Her lady-in-waiting, Marin Cross, stood near the window sorting correspondence with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that emotional visibility in this castle was a tactical error. "Has Lord Pemberton's wife responded to the garden luncheon invitation?" Seraphine asked. She declined. Again. She cited obligations at their northern estate. She cited fear of being seen aligning with a duchess who holds no actual influence, accurate instinct on her part. Seraphine dipped her pen. "Marin, I need you to deliver a message to Garrick Mond, personally, not through the house staff." Marin set down the correspondence. She had served Seraphine since before the marriage, which meant she had known the woman who existed before this castle had begun its patient work of erosion. That woman had laughed without checking whether laughter was appropriate. That woman had argued with her father about land management, not because she wanted to win, but because she believed her ideas deserved the dignity of genuine debate. This woman chose every word the way a surgeon chose instruments. "What message, my lady?" "Tell Garrick that I require a private audience with His Grace this evening, after the assembly adjourns, in the main study, not his personal quarters." And Marin, use exactly those words. "In the main study, not his personal quarters." Marin hesitated. "He will want to know the subject." "The subject is the future." Garrick is intelligent enough to find that answer alarming without additional detail. By the time the Privy Assembly convened at midday, the castle had already absorbed the routine rhythms of governance that Kaelin conducted with the efficiency of a military campaign. 7 ministers occupied carved wooden chairs arranged in a semicircle before the Duke's elevated seat. The configuration was deliberate. No minister could address another without physically turning away from the Duke, which meant every conversation in this room ultimately directed itself toward his attention whether the speaker intended it or not. Aldrich Voss sat at the far right, precisely where Kaelin's peripheral vision could monitor him without the courtesy of direct eye contact. Voss was 43, lean-jawed, impeccably dressed, and possessed of the particular brand of intelligence that consistently mistook cleverness for wisdom. He had spent the last several years accumulating land, marriages, and alliances with the patience of a man building a siege engine one timber at a time. Kaelin had watched every timber arrive. He had let them accumulate, not because he was unaware of the growing threat, but because dismantling an enemy's machinery before it was fully assembled meant you could never be certain you had identified all the parts. "The Northern Tariff Adjustment has been denied," Garrick announced from his position beside the Duke's chair. "His Grace has ordered an independent survey of the Ashenmere Valley. Relief grain will be distributed directly to affected villages pending the surveyor's report." Lord Pemberton, a red-faced man whose physical bulk had expanded in direct proportion to his declining relevance, opened his mouth to protest. "Pemberton," Kaelin's voice carried the room without rising above conversational volume, "your tenants are starving while your new hunting lodge features imported marble flooring. If you wish to discuss this further, I will have the surveyor publish his findings publicly. Choose." Pemberton closed his mouth. The assembly continued through revenue reports, border patrol rotations, and a dispute over fishing rights along the western tributaries. Kaelin resolved each matter with the same forensic precision, cutting through rhetorical padding to isolate the actual decision point, rendering judgment, and moving forward before anyone could confuse deliberation with delay. Through all of it, Voss remained silent. He voted when votes were called. He nodded at appropriate moments. He contributed nothing original and objected to nothing controversial. He was, by every visible measure, a perfectly cooperative member of the assembly. Kaelin watched him the way a falcon watches movement in grass. After the assembly adjourned, Garrick approached with the particular posture that indicated personal rather than administrative business. His shoulders drew inward slightly, reducing his physical footprint as though the information he carried required less space than governance. "Her Grace has requested a private audience this evening in the main study. Not my quarters," she specified. Kaelin stood at the tall window behind his assembly chair, looking down at the inner courtyard where the castle's daily commerce flowed in patterns as predictable as irrigation channels. Stable hands leading horses toward the farrier, kitchen staff receiving deliveries from the market wagons, a gardener trimming hedges along the southern wall with the slow, devoted attention of someone whose entire world measured 6 feet wide and 40 feet long. "What is she doing, Garrick?" It was not a question about her schedule. Garrick understood that. "I am not certain, Your Grace, but she has been corresponding with the Vale Estate solicitors for approximately 3 weeks. 3 weeks? Kaelin turned from the window. "You waited 3 weeks to mention this." "I waited until I had confirmed it was not routine family business. It is not." "What is it?" "I believe she is researching the legal mechanisms by which a marriage of political alliance can be formally dissolved under Duchy Charter." The courtyard below continued its business without interruption. Horses were shod, bread was delivered, hedges were trimmed. The world outside this room had no idea that a sentence had just restructured the interior landscape of a man who had not been genuinely surprised by anything in nearly a decade. Kaelin's face revealed nothing. His hands remained still. His breathing did not change. But somewhere behind the architecture of absolute control, a question formed that he had never needed to ask before. Why? Not why was she leaving? That was a strategic question, and strategic questions had strategic answers. He could enumerate her grievances if pressed. The isolation, the decorative role, the systematic exclusion from any decision that carried real consequence. He was not blind. He had simply never considered these conditions as problems because they were features of the system he had designed, and the system functioned. The question that surfaced now was different and worse. Why did it matter? She was a strategic asset. Her departure would compromise the River Passage alliance, require renegotiation with the Vale family, and create a public perception of instability that his enemies would exploit. These were calculable losses. He could manage them. But Garrick had said the word stationary this morning, and Kaelin had felt something shift in his chest, like a door moving in a room he had believed was sealed. That was the fracture he could not calculate. The main study occupied the ground floor of the western wing, a room designed for negotiation rather than intimidation. Where the assembly chamber enforced hierarchy through elevation and geometry, the study offered 2 leather chairs positioned at equal height before a broad stone fireplace. A desk stood against the far wall, but it was pushed back, secondary. This room said, "Here, we speak as equals." Kaelin had chosen it for precisely that signal, on exactly 2 previous occasions. Both had involved foreign diplomats whose cooperation required the temporary illusion that anyone negotiated with the Duke of Blackthorn as an equal. Seraphine had chosen it tonight, and the message was not lost on him. She entered at 8:15, wearing a dark green dress that bore no jewelry except a single silver chain that had belonged to her mother. No Ashbourne gems, no ducal insignia. She had dressed not as the Duchess of Blackthorn, but as Seraphine Vale, and the distinction landed in the room before she spoke a single word. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said, taking the chair across from him without waiting for invitation. "You are my wife. You do not require an appointment." And yet an appointment is exactly what this required, because in 18 months of marriage, this is the first conversation I have initiated that you could not delegate to Garrick. He studied her. She sat with her hands resting flat on her knees, a posture of deliberate openness that revealed nothing precisely because it concealed nothing. Her eyes held his without challenge, without submission, without any of the emotional weather that he had been trained since childhood to read and exploit in opponents. She was not performing strength. She was simply no longer performing weakness. "Say what you came to say, Seraphine." "I intend to dissolve this marriage." The fire cracked. A log shifted, sending a brief constellation of sparks upward into the flue. Somewhere in the castle's deeper corridors, a door closed with the muffled authority that stone walls lent to every sound. On what grounds? On the grounds that a marriage without partnership is a tenancy, and I am not a tenant in my own life. You have been provided with every comfort this duchy can offer. Yes, every comfort except the one that costs you nothing and changes everything. You have never once asked me what I think about anything that matters. Not policy, not governance, not the future of the alliance my family's river passage made possible. You married the most strategically significant woman on this continent and then stored me like a painting you already owned. He did not argue. He did not deflect. He sat perfectly still and let her words enter the room fully, not because he was absorbing them with empathy, but because he was running calculations. How to contain this? How to redirect her? How to identify the leverage that would return this situation to a configuration he controlled? "Dissolution requires mutual consent under the Duchy Charter," he said. "I do not consent." "I know. That is why I had my solicitors research the alternative." She reached into the fold of her dress and produced a single sheet of paper, dense with legal text. Section 14 of the original alliance compact between Blackthorn and Vale contains a withdrawal clause. If either party can demonstrate that the terms of partnership have been materially unfulfilled, the contract reverts to its pre-marriage conditions. My father insisted on that clause over your negotiators' objections. You allowed it because you believed it would never be invoked. Your father was protecting his family. My father was protecting me. Specifically, she set the document on the small table between their chairs. You fulfilled the economic terms flawlessly. every trade agreement honored, every tariff adjusted per schedule, every revenue share deposited on time. But the compact also specifies, and I am quoting from the language your own chancellors drafted, genuine integration of the Vale family into Blackthorn's governing structure. Genuine integration, not a tower suite and a wardrobe allowance. Kalen picked up the document. He read it with the same focused precision he brought to every legal instrument, every treaty, every piece of intelligence that crossed his desk. His eyes moved line by line. His expression did not change, but his hand, the one holding the lower edge of the paper, pressed harder than necessary against the parchment. The pressure was invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. Seraphine was looking for it. "This clause is arguable," he said finally. "Any chancellor would recognize that integration is a matter of interpretation." "Then argue it. Convene a tribunal. Let every minister and noble family in this duchy watch the Iron Duke of Blackthorn publicly debate whether or not he treated his wife as a human being. Let Aldrich Voss sit in that gallery and take notes on exactly how fractured this household has become." She leaned forward, not aggressively, but with the settled certainty of someone who had already lived past the fear this moment was supposed to produce. "You will win the legal argument, Kalen. Your chancellors are brilliant, and the language is ambiguous enough to support your interpretation. But you will lose something that no tribunal can return to you. You will lose the ability to pretend that everything inside these walls functions the way you designed it." Silence held the room for a long time. The fire had settled into a low, steady burn. The shadows on the wall moved slowly, tidal, as though the castle itself were breathing around this conversation. "What do you want?" he asked. The question was stripped of diplomatic framing. It was not a negotiation opener. It was the raw inquiry of a man confronting a variable that did not behave according to any model he possessed. "I want to leave, quietly, without spectacle. I will return to the Vale estate and resume management of my family's holdings. The River Passage Alliance can be renegotiated separately between your chancellors and my father's representatives on commercial terms that do not require my body as collateral. And if I refuse?" She stood. Not abruptly, not dramatically. She simply rose from the chair the way someone rises when a conversation has reached its natural conclusion, when everything essential has been said and remaining seated would only dilute what has already been communicated. "Then I will stay in this castle, in that tower, in that beautiful room with that perfect light, and every single day you will walk past my door knowing that the person behind it chose silence over your company. And that knowledge, Kalen, will do more damage to you than any army Aldrich Voss could ever assemble." She moved toward the door. Her stride was unhurried, measured, absent of any theatrical flourish. She did not look back. She did not pause for his response. "Seraphine." She stopped at the threshold, but did not turn. "I will have the dissolution papers prepared by morning." She remained still for a moment, and in that stillness Kalen searched for something. Any fracture in her composure, any tremor that would indicate this decision carried emotional weight she had not yet processed, any crack through which he might reach the part of her that had once stood beside him at the altar and believed, however briefly, that strategic partnership might eventually become something warmer. "Thank you," she said, and left. The door closed behind her with a sound that should have been nothing. Wood meeting stone, hardware settling into its latch. A mechanical function performed thousands of times daily across thousands of doors in a castle that contained more doors than most villages contained buildings. Kalen sat in the empty room and felt the dimensions of his life rearrange themselves around an absence he had not known existed until this moment. He picked up the compact document from the table and read Section 14 again, then a third time. The language was exactly as she had described. His chancellors had drafted it carelessly, treating the integration clause as ceremonial boilerplate, the kind of aspirational language inserted into diplomatic agreements to satisfy sentimental negotiating partners who needed to believe that commerce could coexist with dignity. Seraphine's father had known better. The old Vale patriarch had sat across from Kalen's legal team and insisted on language that everyone in the room believed would never matter, and he had done so knowing that someday it might be the only weapon his daughter could carry out of this castle without anyone noticing. Kalen set the document down. The fire was dying. He did not call for anyone to stoke it. 3 floors above, in the eastern tower, Seraphine Vale sat at her writing desk and began a letter to her father. The pen moved steadily. The ink was dark and certain on the heavy cream paper that bore both crests, Ashbourne and Vale, one above the other. She wrote 4 words, then stopped. The words were, "It is done, Father." She stared at them for a long time. Then she folded the letter unfinished, placed it inside her desk drawer, and pressed her hands flat against the wood surface. Her palms left no marks. Her breathing stayed even. Her face, had anyone been watching, revealed nothing that could be interpreted as grief, relief, or anything between. But in the silence of that tower room, with the vast machinery of Blackthorn Castle humming through stone and timber beneath her, Seraphine Vale allowed herself 3 seconds of something she had not permitted in 18 months. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, the woman who had once believed that marrying into power meant sharing it was gone. In her place sat someone who understood that the most dangerous form of resistance is the willingness to walk away from everything you were taught to want. 2 floors below, in a corridor that connected the western wing to the central keep, Garrick Maund intercepted a sealed message being carried by a junior house steward toward the eastern gate. The message bore the personal cipher of Aldrich Voss. Its intended recipient was Lord Hale Creston, whose estate bordered the Vale River Passage on its northern bank. Garrick broke the seal, read 3 lines, and felt the specific kind of dread that belongs exclusively to men who have spent their entire careers preventing exactly the kind of disaster they are now holding in their hands. Voss knew about the dissolution. He had known before Seraphine had even entered the study, and the message to Creston was not a letter. It was an invitation to a meeting already scheduled for tomorrow evening, at an estate whose location was listed only by coordinates, as though the participants understood that the name of the place would be evidence if the letter were intercepted. Garrick looked toward the western wing, where the Duke's study windows still glowed with dying firelight. Then he looked toward the eastern gate, where the night courier waited to carry a message that would set into motion something far larger than a marital dissolution. The Iron Duke of Blackthorn was about to lose his wife, and someone had been counting on exactly that moment to take everything else. Garrick Maund had survived 3 decades inside Blackthorn Castle by understanding a single principle that most ambitious men learn too late, or never learned at all. Information delivered at the wrong moment becomes a weapon aimed at the person delivering it. He had watched smarter men than himself walk into the Duke's study carrying urgent truths and walk out carrying their own dismissal, not because the truth was unwelcome, but because the timing transformed a messenger into a threat. Tonight, standing in the corridor with Aldrich Voss's intercepted message cooling between his fingers, Garrick performed the calculation that had kept him alive through 2 dukes and a political landscape that reshuffled its loyalties the way card players reshuffled decks. He weighed the cost of waking Kaelin now, raw from whatever had transpired in that study with the Duchess, against the cost of waiting until morning when the Duke's analytical machinery would be fully operational and capable of processing conspiracy without confusing it with personal injury. He chose morning. Then he chose wrong. By the time Garrick reached the Duke's quarters at dawn, Kaelin was already dressed and standing at the narrow window that overlooked the eastern courtyard. He had not slept. That much was evident not from his appearance, which was as precisely assembled as every other morning of his adult life, but from the position of the single candle on his writing desk. It had burned to a stub no taller than a man's thumb. He had been sitting at that desk for hours, doing nothing that left any written evidence on the blank pages stacked beside the dead candle. "You intercepted something last night," Kaelin said without turning from the window. Garrick stopped 3 paces inside the door. "How did you know?" "Because you are here 6 minutes early, which means you have been awake longer than usual, which means something kept you from sleeping, which means you made a decision last night to withhold information until morning. The only reason you would withhold information from me is if you judged my emotional state too compromised to receive it. You were correct. Give it to me now." Garrick produced the letter. Kaelin read it once, standing. Then he crossed to the writing desk, sat down, and read it again with the slow, methodical attention of a man disassembling a mechanism to understand not just how it worked, but who had built it and why. "Voss knew about the dissolution before it happened," Kaelin said. "That is my assessment as well, Your Grace." "Which means someone in this household informed him. The Duchess requested stationery from the Vale solicitors 3 weeks ago. You told me yesterday. Voss has been corresponding with Creston using coordinate-based locations, which indicates planning that predates her legal research by a significant margin. He set the letter down flat on the desk, aligning its edges with the edge of the wood as though precision of placement could impose order on its contents. Voss did not learn about the dissolution and then begin conspiring. He began conspiring and then ensured the dissolution would happen. You believe he influenced the Duchess? No. Seraphine does not require external influence to recognize that her marriage is a cage. Voss simply identified the timeline. He understood that she would reach this conclusion on her own, and he positioned his strategy to activate the moment she did. Kaelin looked up from the letter. That is significantly more dangerous than a man who creates problems. That is a man who waits for problems to create themselves and then harvest them. What would you like me to do? Find out who in this household has been communicating with Voss's network. Not the junior steward who carried the message. He is a channel, not a source. I want the source. Garrick nodded and turned to leave. And Garrick, the steward stopped. The dissolution papers. Have them prepared as I promised, on my desk by midday. Your Grace, given what we now know, would it not be strategically advisable to delay the dissolution? The Duchess's departure creates exactly the instability Voss is counting on. If she remains, even temporarily, it denies him his catalyst. The question hung in the room like smoke. It was the most logical recommendation Garrick had ever made, and they both knew it. Delaying the dissolution was tactically obvious. It would preserve the appearance of stability, deny Voss his opening, and buy Kaelin time to dismantle the conspiracy from within. It would also mean using Seraphine as a shield. Keeping her inside the castle not because she wanted to stay, but because her presence served his strategy. It would mean doing exactly what she had accused him of doing for 18 months, treating her as an instrument of his power rather than a person with autonomous will. 24 hours ago, Kaelin would have made that calculation without hesitation. Possession was governance. People occupied positions within his system, and the system's stability was the only morality that mattered. He had built Blackthorn on that principle, and the principle had never failed. But last night, a woman had stood up from a leather chair in his study and walked toward a door without looking back. And he had watched her go and felt something in his chest respond to her departure the way stone responds to water that has been falling on it for years. Not cracking, not breaking, just the slow, irreversible knowledge that the surface was no longer what it had been. Prepare the papers, he said. By midday. Garrick left without further comment. He had served this family long enough to recognize the difference between a command issued from strategy and a command issued from something deeper, something that had no name in the vocabulary of men who had spent their entire lives treating emotion as a security vulnerability. The dissolution documents arrived on Kaelin's desk at 11:42, prepared by the Duchy's chief chancellor with the efficiency that came from knowing the Duke's deadlines were not suggestions. 3 pages of legal language dissolving a marriage that had been designed to last as long as the stone walls around it. Every clause properly referenced. Every signature line precisely positioned. A bureaucratic instrument that reduced 18 months of shared residence to a transaction reversal. Kaelin signed his portion without ceremony. His signature was the same sharp, angular script he applied to every official document, controlled and devoid of decorative flourish. He did not pause before signing. He did not reread the terms. He treated his own marriage dissolution with the same procedural discipline he brought to tariff adjustments and border patrol rotations. Then he set down the pen and sat motionless for 4 minutes, staring at his signature drying on parchment, and inside those 4 minutes he conducted a silent audit of his own interior architecture that would have horrified every mentor, advisor, and strategic thinker who had shaped him into the instrument of governance he had become. He searched for what he felt, not what he thought, because thinking was machinery, and machinery performed reliably regardless of the operator's condition. He searched for what existed beneath the thinking, in the territory he had spent his entire adult life paving over with control and discipline and the unshakable conviction that vulnerability was just incompetence wearing a softer mask. What he found was not grief. Grief was an emotion with recognizable edges, something that could be named and therefore managed. What he found was closer to vertigo, The disorienting sensation of looking down and discovering that the ground he had been standing on was not ground at all, but a surface he had constructed himself. And beneath it there was depth he had never measured because measuring it would have required admitting it existed. He rang for Garrick. Deliver the signed papers to the Duchess and arrange for a carriage, whatever route she prefers, whatever escort she requires. Full Vale household provisions restored to her personal accounts immediately. The household will interpret this as defeat, Your Grace. The household can interpret it however it chooses. The household is not the Duke. Garrick took the documents. At the door he paused with the careful hesitation of a man about to cross a line he had respected for 31 years. If I may speak plainly, you have never asked permission before. Do not begin performing deference now. She is not wrong about any of it. Kaelin's jaw tightened, not visibly. The movement was subcutaneous, a flexion of muscle beneath skin that only someone who had studied this face for decades would have detected. Garrick detected it. I know, Kaelin said. 2 words. The most expensive 2 words the Duke of Blackthorn had ever spent. Seraphine received the signed dissolution papers in her tower suite at noon. She opened the leather folio Garrick had delivered, read the 3 pages without sitting down, confirmed that every clause matched the terms she had specified, and set the documents on her writing desk beside the unfinished letter to her father. Merrin watched from the window seat with the rigid stillness of someone who understood that this moment required witness, not commentary. He signed them, Seraphine said. Not a question, not surprise. A statement delivered with the flat precision of someone confirming that a structure she had been testing for months had finally responded exactly as her calculations predicted. Without modification? Merrin asked. Without a single change. Every term I requested exactly as written. Full financial separation, restoration of Vale family accounts, unrestricted departure. That is not the response of a man fighting to keep what he considers his property. Seraphine looked at Merrin for the first time since opening the folio. Something moved behind her eyes, a flicker of recalculation, as though a variable she had accounted for had just shifted its value. No, it is not. She folded the dissolution papers carefully, slid them inside the folio, and placed the folio in the traveling case that already stood packed beside her wardrobe. The case had been packed for 3 days. She had assembled its contents with the same systematic precision that Kaelin applied to military logistics, as though leaving a marriage required the same operational discipline as conducting a campaign. We depart tomorrow at dawn, Seraphine said. The eastern road through Hallsworth, then south to the Vale Crossroads. 3 days of travel if the weather holds. My lady, there is something you should know before we leave. Seraphine turned. Merrin's voice had shifted register, dropping from the professional neutrality of a lady-in-waiting into something lower, more grounded. The voice of a woman delivering intelligence rather than service. Last night, after your audience with the Duke, a courier was dispatched from the Eastern Gate carrying a message under Aldrich Voss's personal cipher. The message was intercepted by Garrick Mond. I do not know its contents, but I know its recipient, Lord Hale Creston. Seraphine's hands stopped moving. Creston's estate bordered the northern bank of the Vale River Passage. If Voss was communicating with Creston using coded routes and concealed meeting locations, the subject was not social correspondence. The River Passage was the single piece of strategic geography that made the Vale family relevant to Blackthorn's power structure. Control the passage, control the trade. Control the trade, control the duchy's economic spine. Voss is making a play for the River Passage, Seraphine said. That is my assessment. While Kaelin is distracted by the dissolution, while the court is focused on the scandal of the Duchess leaving, while every eye in the duchy is pointed at me walking out the front gate, she pressed her palms flat against the surface of the traveling case. Voss waited for me. He did not create this crisis. He positioned himself to exploit it the moment it arrived. Yes. And if I leave tomorrow as planned, I hand him exactly the chaos he needs. The Duke loses his wife, the court loses its stability, and Voss walks into the vacuum with Creston's support and the River Passage as his leverage. Merrin said nothing. She did not need to. The conclusion was visible in the architecture of the situation. As clear and load-bearing as a structural column, that could not be removed without bringing down the ceiling. Seraphine stood in her tower room, surrounded by packed luggage and signed dissolution papers in 18 months of silence she had earned the right to break, and she faced the specific cruelty that power structures impose on the people who try to leave them. Her freedom had a price, and the price was not her comfort or her dignity. The price was knowing that walking away right now served someone else's strategy more than her own. "Unpack the traveling case," she said. "My lady, I'm not staying for him. I am staying because Aldrich Voss does not get to use my departure as a weapon. If this duchy fractures, it will not be because Seraphine Vale provided the fault line." She opened the folio, removed the dissolution papers, and read them again. Every clause was pristine. Every term was exactly what she had fought for. Freedom, financial independence, the restoration of her family name and her autonomy, all of it sitting on cream-colored paper bearing both crests, Ashbourne above Vale, one last time. She set the papers in the drawer beside the unfinished letter to her father. Two documents that represented two different futures, both legitimate, both earned, neither available until the ground beneath Blackthorn stopped shifting. 2 floors below and half a castle's length away, Kaelin Ashbourne was learning the same lesson from the opposite direction. Garrick had identified the source within 90 minutes. Not through interrogation, which attracted attention and rewarded the interrogated with the knowledge that they mattered enough to be questioned, but through the far more effective method of tracing paper. Ink requisitions, courier logs, the administrative debris that ambitious men generated without realizing they were building a trail as readable as footprints in wet clay. The source was Chamberlain Edric Rowe, a mid-ranking court official responsible for household inventory and supply logistics. Rowe had access to every room schedule, every delivery manifest, every visitor log in the castle. He knew which rooms were occupied, which corridors were traveled, and which conversations happened behind which doors. Not because he listened at keyholes, but because keyholes were unnecessary when you controlled the ledger that tracked who requested what, from whom, and when. Rowe had been passing information to Voss's network for approximately 4 months. Not secrets, not military intelligence, something far more useful. Patterns, the rhythm of the Duchess's correspondence, the frequency of her requests for Vale family documents, the date she first contacted her solicitors, the gradual, measurable shift in her daily schedule that indicated a woman transitioning from endurance to departure. Rowe is not a traitor in the traditional sense, Garrick reported. He did not sell state secrets. He sold context. He gave Voss the ability to read your household the way you read a battlefield. Kaelin stood at the broad table in his tactical study, a room separate from both the assembly chamber and the main study. This room contained maps, wall-mounted, table-spread, rolled and archived on shelves that stretched floor to ceiling. Every border, every trade route, every river crossing and mountain pass that defined Blackthorn's geographic reality existed in this room as ink on parchment, and Kaelin had spent uncounted hours in this space converting geography into strategy. Now he stood before a map that showed him nothing he needed to see. "Where's the meeting?" Kaelin asked. "Creston's hunting estate, south of the Ashenmere boundary, technically outside duchy jurisdiction. Tomorrow evening." "Who else?" "We do not yet know. But Creston alone is significant. His territory gives Voss a staging ground adjacent to the river passage. If the Vale Alliance dissolves and Creston pivots to Voss's coalition, they can apply commercial pressure on the passage without needing military force. Tariff manipulation, selective blockades, rerouting of cargo traffic. Economic strangulation is slower than a siege, but far more difficult to prosecute as treason. Because it is not treason, it is commerce." "Precisely." Kaelin placed both hands flat on the map table. His fingers spread across terrain he had memorized so thoroughly that he could have redrawn every contour line from memory. The river passage cut diagonally across the map's lower third, a blue vein threading through green territory that bore the Vale family's boundary markers. He had married Seraphine to secure that vein. He had treated her as the price of geographic advantage. And now the geography was about to be used against him by a man who understood that the Duke's greatest vulnerability was not military or political, but personal. Voss had not built a siege engine. He had built a mirror, and the reflection it produced showed Kaelin exactly what his own system looked like from the outside, a machinery of control that functioned perfectly until the people inside it stopped cooperating. "Assemble a small delegation," Kalen said. 6 riders. No banners, no livery, traveling light. "We leave tonight." "For Creston's estate?" "For the Ashenmere boundary. I want to be within observation distance of that meeting before Voss arrives. I want to know every face that walks through Creston's door. I want names, Garrick, not assumptions. Names." "And the Duchess?" The question was professional. Garrick was asking about logistics, about household management during the Duke's absence, about the practical arrangements required when the castle's primary authority departed on short notice. But the question carried a second frequency that both men could hear, one that asked whether Kalen had considered that leaving the castle right now meant leaving Seraphine inside it, free to depart at any moment, free to complete her exit while he was miles away chasing political ghosts through the countryside. "The Duchess will do whatever the Duchess decides to do," Kalen said. "I no longer arrange her life." "That is a significant change in policy, Your Grace." "It is the only policy that has ever been honest. I simply did not practice it until now." Garrick withdrew to organize the delegation. Kalen remained at the map table. He traced the river passage with one finger, following the blue line from its northern origin through the narrow valley that gave it commercial value, past the trading posts and cargo stations that generated the revenue his duchy depended on, all the way to the coastal ports where Blackthorn's goods met the wider world. His finger stopped at the junction where the passage crossed into Vale territory. That junction was, in every practical sense, the reason Seraphine had been brought into his life. It was a point on a map, a calculation, a piece of strategic arithmetic that had performed exactly as designed for 18 months. And somewhere between that junction and the tower suite where a woman had closed her eyes for 3 seconds and allowed herself to feel something she had been suppressing for a year and a half, the arithmetic had stopped being sufficient. Kalen removed his hand from the map. Tonight, he would ride into darkness to confront a conspiracy that threatened everything he had built. He would do it with 6 men, no banners, and the uncomfortable knowledge that the most dangerous enemy he faced was not Aldrich Voss or Hale Creston or any of the ambitious nobles circling his throne like vultures who had mistaken patience for weakness. The most dangerous enemy was the version of himself that had spent 19 years believing that governing others excused him from governing himself. He left the tactical study and descended toward the stables. The corridor took him past the base of the eastern tower. He did not stop. He did not look up toward the windows where lamplight still burned behind heavy curtains. He walked past the way a man walks past a wound he is not yet ready to examine. Knowing it exists, knowing it is not healing, knowing that the act of continuing forward does not reduce the damage, but simply postpones the reckoning. 3 floors above, Seraphine Vale heard hoofbeats on cobblestone and moved to the window. She watched 6 riders exit through the northern gate, moving fast and dark against the fading light, and she recognized the lead rider's posture before she could identify his face. He was leaving the castle, at night, without ceremony, without announcement, without telling her. The old Seraphine would have interpreted this as proof that nothing had changed, that Kalen still moved through his world as though she occupied no meaningful space within it. The new Seraphine, the one who had unpacked her traveling case an hour ago and locked dissolution papers in a desk drawer, watched those 6 riders disappear into the tree line and understood something far more complex. He was not ignoring her. He was choosing not to use her. Whatever he was riding toward, he had decided to face it without leveraging her presence as a strategic asset. It was not an apology. It was not transformation. It was not the sweeping romantic gesture that stories insisted powerful men eventually produced when confronted with the consequences of their own cruelty. It was a man walking past a door he used to own and not opening it, and for the first time in 18 months, Seraphine did not know what to do with what she felt. The 6 riders reached the Ashenmere boundary 2 hours before midnight. Kalen had pushed the pace hard through terrain he knew by muscle memory, trails carved through dense forest that the duchy maintained not for commerce, but for exactly this kind of movement, fast, invisible, deniable. The horses were lathered and blowing when Garrick signaled the halt at a ridgeline overlooking the shallow valley where Creston's hunting estate sat like a stone fist pressed into cleared ground. Lantern light bled from 3 windows on the estate's western face. Two carriages stood in the courtyard, their horses already unhitched and stabled. A third set of wheel tracks marked the frozen mud leading to the rear entrance, fresher than the others, still sharply defined. "Three parties," Garrick said, dismounting beside Kalen on the ridge. "The first two arrived together or close to it. The third came later and used the service entrance. The third does not want to be associated with the first two, or arrived late and took whatever entrance was unobserved." Kalen studied the estate through the darkness. Creston's hunting lodge was not a military installation. No perimeter guards, no watchtower. A low stone wall surrounded the property, barely chest height, designed to mark territory rather than defend it. The kind of security that assumed no one would be bold enough or desperate enough to approach uninvited. Take Harlan and Deckett around the eastern approach. Get close enough to identify the carriages, crests, livery markings, anything. I want names before dawn. Garrick hesitated. It was the kind of hesitation that carried weight between men who had worked in proximity for decades. A half second of silence that communicated more than most men expressed in entire conversations. "Say it," Kalen said. "If Voss is inside that building, he has already calculated the possibility that you would intercept his correspondence and respond exactly this way. You are doing what he expects. I am gathering intelligence. That is not a trap. That is procedure. Procedure assumes your opponent has not already accounted for your procedures." Kalen looked at Garrick. The moonlight was thin, cloud-filtered, but enough to read the steward's face. Garrick was not afraid. Fear was an emotion that required imagination, and Garrick operated on evidence. What Garrick was expressing was something more precise and more useful than fear. It was recognition. The specific recognition of a man who had watched enough powerful men make decisions in compromised emotional states to identify the pattern even when the man making the decision could not. "You think I am here because of her," Kalen said. "I think you are here because 3 days ago you would have sent a delegation and remained at the castle where your authority is physically present and symbolically reinforced. You are standing on a frozen ridge in the dark because something has changed in how you make decisions, and the change happened in the last 48 hours. The change happened because Aldrich Voss is assembling a coalition to dismantle my authority. That is sufficient cause. Yes, it is also not the reason you are here personally." Kalen turned back toward the estate. Below, a door opened and closed. A figure crossed the courtyard carrying a lantern, moving with the unhurried gait of someone on domestic business, probably a servant checking the stabled horses. The light swung in small arcs, painting brief yellow smears across the mud. "Get me the names, Garrick." Garrick took Harlan and Deckett down the eastern slope without further comment. Kalen remained on the ridge with the 3 remaining riders, positioned in a tree line thick enough to absorb their silhouettes. The horses were walked deeper into the woods and picketed out of sight. One of the riders, a young man named Soren who served as Kalen's personal guard, positioned himself at the Duke's left shoulder with the automatic precision of someone who had been trained to treat proximity as protection. They waited. The cold settled into the ground and rose through boot leather and into bone. Kalen did not pace. He did not shift his weight. He stood as still as the trees around him and watched the estate and conducted inside his own skull an inventory that had nothing to do with the conspiracy unfolding below. Garrick was right. He was here because something had changed. Not in the political landscape, though the political landscape had certainly shifted. Not in Voss's behavior, though Voss's ambitions had clearly escalated. The change was internal, structural, as fundamental as a weight-bearing wall that had been quietly removed from a building that continued to stand only because momentum and habit had not yet informed gravity. Seraphine had looked at him last night and spoken with the clarity of someone who had already finished grieving a relationship, while the other person was still pretending it did not require grief. She had not been cruel, she had not been vindictive. She had been precise, and her precision had exposed a truth that Kalen's entire system of self-understanding was not equipped to process. He had believed, with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been seriously contradicted, that his marriage functioned because it produced the outcomes he had designed it to produce. Trade routes remained open. Revenue flowed. Political stability persisted. The metrics were excellent. Therefore, the system was sound. But systems that measured only their own outputs could not detect their own rot. A bridge that reported its own structural integrity based solely on the number of carriages crossing it would never identify the crack forming in its foundation, because the crack did not reduce traffic until the moment it reduced everything. She was the crack. Not because she was weak, but because she was the first honest signal his system had ever produced, and his system was not designed to process honesty. It was designed to process compliance. The cold deepened. An hour passed, then another. Garrick returned at 2:15 in the morning, moving through the tree line with the practiced silence of a man who had learned decades ago that noise was a form of carelessness. He carried a folded piece of paper and an expression that Kaelin had seen exactly once before, the night Garrick had informed the previous Duke that his own brother was plotting against him. "3 parties confirmed," Garrick said, his voice low enough that the words seemed to materialize directly inside the ear rather than traveling through air. "First carriage belongs to Lord Creston, as expected. Second carriage bears the Voss household livery, partially concealed with plain canvas covers. And the third?" Garrick unfolded the paper. It was not intelligence. It was a sketch, rough charcoal lines drawn quickly in minimal light by a man with an excellent visual memory. The sketch showed a carriage crest, 2 crossed keys beneath a crown, the whole thing bordered by a laurel wreath that was distinctive enough to identify from 50 feet in near darkness. Kaelin stared at the crest. His breathing did not change. His posture did not shift. His face, in the thin moonlight, could have been carved from the same stone that built his castle. But Soren, standing at his left shoulder, felt something change in the air around the Duke, the way a dog feels a storm arriving before the first cloud appears. "That is the Blackthorn Chancellery seal," Kaelin said. "Yes, Your Grace." "That is my own chancellery." "Yes." "Who?" Garrick met his eyes with the steady, unflinching gaze of a man delivering a wound he could not prevent and would not soften. "The carriage is assigned to Chancellor Braden Hale." The name landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. Braden Hale, Chief Chancellor of Blackthorn, the man who had prepared Kaelin's dissolution papers 12 hours ago, the man who had overseen every legal instrument, every diplomatic treaty, every commercial agreement that the duchy had executed for the past 11 years. The man Kaelin had personally elevated from a minor judicial appointment to the highest administrative position in the realm because he possessed the one quality Kaelin valued above all others: reliability. Braden Hale had never once, in 11 years, given Kaelin reason to question his loyalty. He had administered the duchy's legal framework with mechanical precision. He had drafted the marriage compact that brought Seraphine into Blackthorn. He had drafted the dissolution papers that would let her leave. He had been trusted with every document, every contract, every piece of legal architecture that held the duchy together, not because Kaelin liked him, but because Kaelin had tested him, year after year, and the tests had produced consistent results. Consistent results. The same metric Kaelin had used to evaluate his marriage. The same metric that measured outputs and ignored the human being producing them. "How long?" Kaelin asked. "We do not know." Deckett observed all 3 parties entering the main hall together. Body language suggests familiarity, not introduction. This is not their first meeting. "How long, Garrick? Your best assessment." Garrick was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, calculating. Assembling evidence into a timeline the way a mason assembles stones into a wall, each piece selected for how it bears weight against the others. The weighted representation petition that Voss submitted to the assembly. The legal language was sophisticated, too sophisticated for Voss, who is politically cunning, but not a trained legal mind. The drafting style was consistent with chancellery work. Hale's section. "The petition was submitted 6 weeks ago." "Yes." "So Hale has been working with Voss for at least 6 weeks. More likely longer, since drafting a petition of that complexity requires preliminary discussion, strategic alignment, agreement on objectives. My estimate would be 3 months, possibly 4. 4 months. 1/3 of Seraphine's entire residency as Duchess. While Kaelin had been evaluating his wife's silence as strategic compliance, his own chancellor had been quietly building the legal foundation for an alternative power structure. While the Duke had been so focused on maintaining his system that he failed to notice one of its occupants walking away, another occupant had been disassembling the machinery from inside. The irony was not lost on him. It was in fact so precisely constructed that it felt almost architectural, as though the universe had designed this moment specifically to demonstrate to Kalen Ashbourne that the principle he had built his life around, that absolute control produced absolute security, was not merely flawed, but exactly inverted. His control had produced his vulnerability. The tighter he had gripped, the less he had felt. And the less he felt, the more easily the people inside his grip had moved without his detection. "Your orders, Your Grace." Kalen's mind ran scenarios the way a river runs channels, simultaneously, branching, testing each path for speed and obstruction. The military option. Ride down to the estate with 6 men, confront the conspirators directly, arrest Hale on charges of sedition, and rely on the Duke's sovereign authority to override any legal objection. Quick, decisive, and catastrophically counterproductive because arresting your own chancellor in the middle of the night at a meeting you were not supposed to know about transformed a manageable conspiracy into a public spectacle that every noble family in the duchy would interpret as tyranny. The political option. Return to the castle, say nothing, gather more intelligence over the coming weeks, identify every participant, every communication channel, every financial transaction that connected Voss's coalition. Build an airtight case, present it to the assembly. Dismantle the conspiracy through institutional procedure. Methodical. Elegant. And impossibly slow, because Voss had timed his operation to exploit the dissolution's instability, which meant every day Kalen spent gathering evidence was a day Voss spent consolidating power. The third option. The one that Kalen's instincts rejected with the visceral revulsion of a man being asked to amputate his own hand. Do nothing different. Let Seraphine leave. Let the dissolution proceed. Let the political instability unfold. Let Voss believe his plan was working. And then, from within the chaos that every enemy expected to destroy him, rebuild from the foundation up, using the crisis not as a threat to be managed, but as a demolition that cleared ground for a structure that did not depend on control to remain standing. The third option required something Kalen had never practiced: trust. Not the strategic simulation of trust that powerful men deployed to manipulate loyalty, but the actual, unprotected, operationally insane act of trusting other people to behave according to their own judgment rather than his design. He was not ready for that option. He might never be. But standing on a frozen ridge at 2:30 in the morning, staring down at a building that contained his own chancellor conspiring with his enemies, Kalen Ashbourne confronted a truth that arrived not as revelation, but as structural failure. His system was broken. Not damaged, not stressed. Broken. The people inside it had not rebelled. They had simply stopped believing in it, one by one, each departure so quiet that the machinery had continued running on momentum alone, producing outputs that looked like governance but were actually just elaborate patterns of force applied to a world that had already stopped consenting. Seraphine had been the first to say it out loud. Hale had been the first to act on it in secret. And Voss, the clever, patient, deeply dangerous Voss, had been the first to understand that Kalen's empire was not a fortress. It was a performance. And performances ended the moment the audience stopped watching. "We returned to the castle," Kalen said. Garrick waited for elaboration. None came. "Your Grace, Hale will return to his post by morning. He will sit at his desk, administer your legal affairs, and prepare documents for your signature with the same efficiency he has always demonstrated. You will look at him across the assembly table knowing what he has done. What is your plan?" "My plan is to not have a plan." Garrick's expression did not change, because Garrick's expression rarely changed, but something shifted behind his eyes that communicated the specific alarm of a career administrator hearing his employer abandon the foundational principle of his entire governance philosophy. "You're going to improvise," Garrick said, and the words sounded in his mouth like a diagnosis. "I'm going to stop pretending that my control of Blackthorn was ever as complete as I believed it was. I have a chancellor conspiring against me. I have a wife dissolving our marriage. I have a political rival assembling a coalition under my own roof. Every one of these failures occurred while I was paying attention, while I was monitoring, while I was controlling. The control did not prevent any of it. The control is what made it possible because every person in my system learned to operate beneath my attention rather than within it." He mounted his horse. The animal shifted beneath him, sensing the rider's tension in the way horses always sense what humans believe they are concealing. "Garrick, when we return, you will say nothing about Hale to anyone. Not to the house staff, not to my guard, not to the Duchess. You will continue your duties exactly as before. And Hale will continue his duties exactly as before. He will draft documents. He will attend the assembly. He will administer the duchy's legal architecture with the same precision he has always demonstrated. And he will do all of this believing that his secret remains intact. You are giving him rope. I am giving him the one thing that every betrayer eventually destroys himself with: confidence." They rode back through the dark forest. The trail was narrower heading east, compressed by undergrowth that the duchy's trail crews had not yet cleared for the season. Branches scraped against leather and armor. The horses navigated by instinct through terrain that moonlight could not fully illuminate. Kalen rode at the front. Behind him, 5 men maintained formation without conversation. They had been trained to operate in silence, to treat every mission as confidential until explicitly told otherwise. They did not know what had been observed at Creston's estate. They did not know the name Braden Hale. They knew only that the Duke had ridden out in darkness and was now riding back, and that his silence on the return was different from his silence on the approach. The outbound silence had been focused, anticipatory, the silence of a predator moving toward a target. The return silence was heavier, denser, loaded with something none of them could identify, but all of them could feel. They reached the castle at 4:30. The eastern horizon was still black, but the air had that specific pre-dawn density, cold compressed into a weight that pressed against the skin and smelled of frost and wet stone. The northern gate opened without challenge. The guard captain recognized the Duke's silhouette and waved the party through with the automatic deference of a man who had learned that questioning the Duke's movements was indistinguishable from questioning the Duke's authority. Kalen dismounted in the main courtyard. Garrick took the reins and signaled a stable hand. The riders dispersed toward their quarters. Within minutes, the courtyard was empty, and the castle absorbed the Duke's return the way deep water absorbs a stone, without ripple, without evidence, as though the surface had never been disturbed. He climbed the northern staircase. His boots struck limestone in the rhythm the kitchen staff would synchronize their bread timers to in 90 minutes. 3rd floor, 4th floor. The corridor that connected the central keep to the residential wings. He stopped at the junction. Left led to his personal quarters. Right led to the eastern tower. Kalen stood at the junction for 11 seconds. He counted them. Not consciously, but with the internal clock that men develop when they have spent their entire lives measuring the distance between decision and consequence. 11 seconds during which the Duke of Blackthorn stood in a stone corridor in his own castle and confronted the fact that turning right would take him to Seraphine's door, and that arriving at her door at 4:30 in the morning after a covert reconnaissance mission would communicate either desperation or dependence, and that he could not determine which of those two options was worse because both required admitting that her presence in his calculations had migrated from the strategic column to the personal column without his authorization. He turned left. Inside his quarters, he removed his riding coat, placed his ceremonial blade on its mount, and sat at the writing desk where a candle stub still stood from the previous sleepless night. He did not light a new candle. He sat in darkness and let his mind work without directing it. Hale. The name cycled through his thoughts with the grinding persistence of a mill wheel. Braden Hale, who had been chosen because he was reliable. Braden Hale, who had been tested and retested and who had passed every test. Braden Hale, who had been trusted precisely because trust was not what Kalen offered. What Kalen offered was a system in which trust was unnecessary because compliance was engineered. Hale had never needed to be loyal. He had only needed to be efficient. And when a more efficient opportunity presented itself, his transition from servant to conspirator had required no moral crisis, no crisis of conscience, no dramatic moment of decision. He had simply shifted his efficiency to a new employer the way a river shifts its course when a new channel offers less resistance. That was the education. Not that betrayal existed. Kalen had always known betrayal existed. He had built his entire governance philosophy around its inevitability. Every redundancy, every surveillance protocol, every carefully maintained network of informants and auditors existed because Kalen assumed that any person, given sufficient motivation, would betray him. The education was that his defenses against betrayal had themselves become the mechanism of betrayal. He had created a system so thoroughly controlled that the people inside it had no reason to develop genuine loyalty. Loyalty required choice. Choice required freedom. Freedom required trust. And trust was the one resource Kalen had systematically eliminated from every relationship he maintained, personal, political, and marital. He had built a machine that produced obedience and called it governance. He had built a marriage that produced stability and called it partnership. And now the obedience was revealing itself as mere proximity, and the stability was revealing itself as mere silence. And the man who had spent 19 years perfecting the art of control was sitting in the dark discovering that control and connection were not just different strategies, they were opposing forces. And he had chosen the wrong one for so long that the right one had become foreign territory, unmapped, ungoverned, as terrifying to him as any battlefield he had ever faced. Dawn arrived. Gray light crept through the narrow window. The castle stirred beneath him with the slow, systemic awakening that had been his earliest childhood soundtrack. Stone warming under sun, iron gates grinding open, the distant percussion of kitchens and stables and guard rotations that constituted the pulse of an organism far larger and far older than any single ruler who had ever occupied its central chamber. Kalen stood. He washed his face with cold water from the basin beside his bed. He dressed in black as always. He descended the northern staircase at exactly 6 minutes past dawn, and his fifth step landed on the landing stone with the sharp finality that sent the head baker reaching for his oven. Garrick waited beside the eastern hearth. Their eyes met. Garrick's expression carried the specific neutrality that communicated a complete briefing compressed into a single glance. Nothing has changed publicly. The secret holds. The day begins. Chancellor Braden Hale entered the assembly chamber at precisely 9 o'clock, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the composed, mildly industrious expression of a man whose professional identity depended on projecting competence without ambition. He took his customary seat to the left of the Duke's chair, arranged his papers with the methodical care that Kalen had once found reassuring and now recognized as camouflage, and raised his eyes to meet the Duke's with the same respectful, slightly deferential gaze he had maintained for 11 years. Kalen looked at him, held the gaze, let the moment extend one beat longer than routine, just long enough for something unnameable to pass between them, and then looked away toward the assembled ministers. Hale's expression did not change, but his left hand, the one resting on the portfolio's edge, pressed slightly harder against the leather, a fraction of an ounce of additional pressure that meant nothing to anyone in the room, except two men. The Duke who had seen the betrayal, and the Chancellor who had not yet realized he had been seen. "Gentlemen," Kalen said, his voice carrying the room with its customary authority. "Let us begin." The assembly convened. Reports were delivered. Votes were cast. The business of governance continued with the surface precision that Blackthorn was famous for. Every mechanism turning, every procedure followed, every participant performing their designated function within a system that appeared from every measurable angle to be operating flawlessly. And beneath that surface, in the unmeasured space where human beings made the decisions that no system could predict or control, the ground had already shifted. Kalen sat in his elevated chair, administering his duchy with the same forensic precision he had always demonstrated, and for the first time in his life, he understood that the chair itself was the problem. Elevation created distance. Distance created blindness. Blindness created the conditions under which a trusted chancellor could walk into an enemy's estate carrying the Duke's own legal architecture as a gift, and the Duke would not know until the structure was already hollowed from within. The session ended at noon. Ministers filed out. Hale organized his papers, exchanged a brief word with Garrick about scheduling, and departed through the eastern corridor with the measured stride of a man whose conscience was either perfectly clear or perfectly managed. Kalen watched him go. Then he turned to Garrick, who had remained beside the Duke's chair with the patient stillness of a man waiting for an order he already knew was coming. "Send word to Seraphine," Kalen said. "I need to speak with her. Not as the Duke. Not about the dissolution." "As what then?" The question deserved an answer Kalen did not yet possess. He searched for it the way a man searches for footing on unfamiliar ground, testing each surface before committing weight, knowing that the wrong step would not just fail, but would destroy the credibility of every step that followed. As someone who needs to tell her that she was right about more than she knew, and that the cost of proving it may be higher than either of us can afford, Garrick nodded once and left. Kaylin remained in the empty assembly chamber. Sunlight fell through the high windows in geometric patterns that he had memorized years ago. The same angles, the same shadows, the same predictable architecture of light that had accompanied every session he had ever conducted from this chair. But today the light illuminated a room he no longer recognized. Not because the room had changed, but because the man sitting in it had been forced, by a wife's clarity and a chancellor's betrayal and a frozen ridge in the dark, to see what had always been there. The chamber was not a seat of governance. It was a theater. And the performance it staged, the daily ritual of control and compliance and measured authority, had been running for 19 years before an audience that had long since stopped believing in the show. What remained when the performance ended and the audience left and the lights went dark was a man in an empty room who had to decide whether to rebuild the theater or step outside and discover what existed beyond its walls. He did not yet know the answer, but for the first time in his life, Kaylin Ashbourne was willing to stand in the question without reaching for control, and that willingness, fragile and unfamiliar and more frightening than any conspiracy, was the first honest foundation he had ever laid. Somewhere in the Eastern Tower, Seraphine Vale received Garrick's message and read it twice. Then she set it down, walked to the window, and looked out at the same courtyard where she had watched 6 riders disappear into darkness the night before. She did not know what had happened during the night. She did not know about Hale, about Creston's estate, about the conspiracy that was coiling itself around the duchy she had just legally separated herself from. But she knew Kaylin. She had spent 18 months studying him the way a cartographer studies terrain. Not with affection, but with the meticulous attention that survival demanded when you lived inside someone else's power. And the message Garrick had delivered contained 4 words that did not belong in the vocabulary of the man she had married. I need to tell her. Not I require. Not I wish to discuss. Not the measured transactional language of a man who framed every communication as an exercise of authority. I need. Seraphine looked at the courtyard for a long time. Then she turned from the window and told Marin to inform Garrick that she would meet the Duke in the main study at 8 o'clock tonight. Same room, same chairs, same fireplace. Everything else, entirely unknown. The main study smelled of ash and leather, and the particular stillness that rooms develop when they have held too many conversations that change the shape of the lives conducted within them. The fire had been lit an hour before Seraphine arrived, long enough for the room to absorb warmth, but not long enough to erase the cold that had settled into the stone during the day. 2 leather chairs faced the hearth. Same configuration, same implied equality. But the man sitting in the left chair was not the same man who had sat there 2 nights ago, and the woman who entered at 8 o'clock recognized the difference before she crossed the threshold. Kaylin stood when she entered. He had never stood for her before. Not once in 18 months, not at formal dinners, not at court presentations, not at the private meals they had occasionally shared in the early weeks of their marriage, before silence had replaced conversation and proximity had replaced intimacy. Standing when a woman entered was a gesture that belonged to a social vocabulary he had long ago dismissed as decorative. He stood anyway. Seraphine registered it the way she registered everything in this castle, with the precise analytical attention of someone who had learned that survival in a controlled environment depended on detecting shifts before they became events. She sat in the right chair without commenting on the gesture. Commenting would have given it more weight than either of them was prepared to support. "Thank you for coming," Kaylin said. "You said you needed to tell me something. That word was unusual for you." "Which word?" "Need." He sat. The fire cracked between them. Shadows moved on the walls in the slow, tidal rhythm that this room always produced, as though the castle's breath filled this space more completely than any other. 2 nights ago, after you left this room, Garrick intercepted a coded message from Aldrich Voss to Lord Hale Creston. The message referenced a meeting at Creston's hunting estate. I rode out with 6 men to observe. 3 parties attended. Voss, Creston. He paused. Not for dramatic effect. for the specific kind of internal resistance that accompanies speaking a truth that demolishes a structure you spent years building. And Chancellor Braden Hale, Seraphine's hands resting flat on her knees in the same posture of deliberate openness she had used during their first conversation in this room, did not move. Her breathing did not change, but her eyes narrowed by a fraction of a degree, the involuntary contraction of someone performing rapid recalculation. Your own Chancellor. My own Chancellor, the man who drafted our marriage compact, the man who prepared the dissolution papers you now hold, the man who has administered every legal instrument this duchy has produced for 11 years. How long has he been working with Voss? Garrick estimates 3 to 4 months, possibly longer. And you discovered this 2 nights ago. Yes. Which means you signed the dissolution papers knowing that your political position was under coordinated attack. You gave me everything I asked for: full financial separation, unrestricted departure, restoration of my family's accounts, while your own Chancellor was conspiring to dismantle your authority. She studied him with the frank, unblinking assessment of someone who had stopped trying to see what she wanted to see and was now simply seeing what was there. Why? Because keeping you here to serve as a shield against political instability would have proved every word you said to me in this room 2 nights ago. That has never stopped you before. No, it has not. The honesty sat between them like a weapon neither of them had expected to be placed on the table. Not a rhetorical weapon, not a strategic concession designed to purchase trust through the appearance of vulnerability. Just a fact, delivered by a man whose entire identity had been constructed around the principle that facts were tools, and tools existed to serve the user's objectives. This fact served nothing except the truth. Seraphine was quiet for a long time. The fire settled. A log collapsed inward, releasing a burst of sparks that spiraled upward and vanished into the flue. Somewhere in the castle's deeper corridors, a guard changed position with the muffled percussion of boot leather on stone. What do you want from me, Kaelin? Information. You understand the Vale River Passage better than anyone in this duchy, including me. If Voss is positioning himself to control that passage through Creston's alliance, I need to understand the vulnerabilities. Which access points can be commercially blockaded without military action? Which trade routes can be rerouted? Which stakeholders along the passage would support a shift in control and which would resist? You are asking me to help you defend a duchy I am legally separating from. I am asking you to help me defend a duchy that your family built the most important piece of. The river passage is Vale territory. If Voss takes control of it through Creston, the people affected are not my ministers or my nobles. They are your father's tenants, your family's workers, the villages that have survived for generations because the Vale name meant the passage stayed open and fair. Her jaw tightened. It was the first visible emotion she had displayed in either of their conversations in this room, a muscular response that bypassed her considerable discipline and arrived on her face before she could intercept it. He had struck a nerve he had not been aiming for, or perhaps had been aiming for without admitting it. The Vale family was not an abstraction to Seraphine. It was a living system of people and obligations and loyalties that she had been raised inside the way Kaelin had been raised inside stone walls. Show me what you have, she said. They moved to the writing desk. Kaelin spread the intercepted message, Garrick's sketches, and a regional map across the surface. For the next 90 minutes, they worked side by side in the closest thing to genuine partnership their marriage had ever produced. Seraphine identified 3 critical choke points along the river passage where commercial traffic could be disrupted without triggering the duchy's military protocols. She outlined the network of local merchants and barge operators whose cooperation was essential to any blockade strategy and whose loyalties were divided between Vale family tradition and economic self-interest. She drew from memory a detailed diagram of the cargo scheduling system that regulated traffic flow through the narrowest section of the passage, a system her father had designed and that she had helped administer since she was 17 years old. Kaelin listened. Not the way he listened in the assembly, where listening was a form of surveillance designed to identify weakness and exploit opportunity. He listened the way a man listens when he realizes that the person speaking knows something he needs and that no amount of authority can substitute for their expertise. Voss does not need to physically seize the passage, Seraphine said. pointing to the junction where the river crossed into Vale territory. He needs to make it economically unviable for the Vale family to maintain independent control. If Creston applies tariff pressure from the north and Voss restricts cargo licensing from his position in the assembly, my father's operating costs triple within 6 months. At that point, the Vale family has two choices: accept Voss's terms and become a subordinate partner, or abandon the passage entirely and watch it transfer to Creston's control by default. Your father would never accept subordination. My father would fight until it killed him, which is exactly what Voss is counting on. An aging patriarch exhausting his resources in a war of attrition against a younger coalition with deeper pockets and a chancellor providing legal cover for every move they make. Kaelin looked at the map. The river passage cut across the parchment like a surgical incision, dividing territory that had been unified under Blackthorn's authority for 3 generations. He had spent his career reading maps the way generals read them, as terrain to be controlled, borders to be defended, choke points to be exploited. But standing beside Seraphine, hearing her describe the passage not as geography, but as a living system of families and workers and generational obligations, he recognized that his map reading had always been missing the dimension that made territory worth defending. People, not populations, not labor resources, not demographic assets. People. I have a proposal, Seraphine said, but you will not like it. I have not liked anything that has happened in the last 72 hours. Continue. Hale does not know you have seen him. That is your only advantage. If you confront him, he destroys evidence, alerts Voss, and the conspiracy goes underground where you cannot reach it. If you wait, Voss continues building his coalition unchallenged. I am aware of the constraints. Then you are also aware that the only way to expose the entire network is to let the conspiracy advance far enough that every participant commits to an overt act. Something documented, something public, something that cannot be retracted or explained away as misunderstanding. You want me to let them attack. I want you to let them believe they are winning. There is a difference. Kaelin stared at her. The woman who had packed her traveling case 3 days ago and prepared to leave this castle forever was now proposing a strategy that required her to remain inside the very power structure she had rejected. Not as a decorative duchess, not as a political asset, as an architect of a counter-operation that depended on her knowledge, her judgment, and her willingness to occupy a position of genuine strategic authority. This requires you to stay, he said. This requires me to choose to stay, for my own reasons, to protect my family's legacy. Not because you asked. Not because the duchy needs a duchess, because Aldrich Voss does not get to use the Vale River Passage as a stepping stone to power, and I am the only person in this castle who knows that system well enough to defend it. And us? The word landed between them with the weight of something that had never been spoken aloud in 18 months of shared residence. There had been no us. There had been an arrangement, a contract, a configuration of 2 people occupying adjacent positions within a system designed by one of them. The word us implied a category that neither of them had constructed, and neither of them knew how to occupy. There is no us, Seraphine said. Not yet. Not until this is finished, and I can evaluate whether the man standing next to me in a crisis is the same man who will be standing next to me when the crisis ends. I have watched you operate under pressure, Kaelin. You are extraordinary. What I have never seen is who you are when there is nothing to fight. He absorbed that. It was not a rejection. It was not an acceptance. It was a conditional framework delivered with the precision of a contract clause, and he recognized it as such because it was the language they both spoke fluently, the language of terms and conditions and measurable outcomes. But beneath the language, in the space between the words she chose and the words she did not choose, something else was present. Something he could not quantify or control or reduce to strategic advantage. Something that felt, if he was honest with himself, like the first draft of trust being written by 2 people who had never practiced the alphabet. Agreed, he said. Where do we begin? They began at dawn the next morning. Seraphine sent a coded message to her father through Marin, using a private cipher that predated the Blackthorn marriage and existed outside any communication channel the duchy monitored. The message outlined the threat to the river passage, and requested that the Vale family's network of trade operators and local administrators begin quietly documenting any unusual commercial activity along the passage's northern border. Not resisting, not confronting, simply recording every transaction, every tariff change, every cargo rerouting that deviated from established patterns. Kalin, simultaneously, instructed Garrick to implement what he called passive surveillance on Chancellor Hale. No interrogation, no confrontation, no change in routine. Garrick would simply ensure that every document Hale produced, every meeting he attended, every correspondence he sent or received was copied before delivery and archived in a secure location that only Garrick and the Duke could access. The goal was not to build a case. The goal was to build a map, a complete topographical rendering of the conspiracy's structure, its participants, its financial channels, and its timeline. 3 days passed, then 4. The Assembly continued its sessions. Hale administered the duchy's legal framework. Voss attended meetings and cast votes and demonstrated the same cooperative silence that Kalin now recognized not as deference but as patience. The surface of Blackthorn's governance remained flawless. Beneath the surface, the evidence accumulated with the slow, implacable weight of snowfall on an already stressed roof. Garrick's archive grew. Seraphine's father reported the first documented irregularities along the northern passage. 3 cargo shipments redirected through Creston's territory without explanation. A licensing fee increased by 40% at a checkpoint that had maintained stable rates for a decade. Small pressures. Individual incidents that could each be explained away as administrative routine, but taken together, viewed from above like a map that revealed patterns invisible at ground level, they formed a coherent strategy of economic encirclement. On the 5th day, Hale made his move. He submitted a document to the Assembly titled Emergency Economic Stabilization Provisions. The language was dense, technical, and carefully designed to appear routine. It proposed temporary regulatory authority over commercial waterways during periods of trade disruption, granting the Chancellery power to approve or deny cargo licensing, set tariff rates, and appoint regional administrators without Assembly vote. It was a legal weapon disguised as bureaucratic procedure. If passed, it would give Hale's office direct control over the river passage during any period of economic instability, and Voss's coalition was already manufacturing exactly the instability the provision required. Kalin read the document in the Assembly chamber, while Hale presented it with the measured, professionally detached tone of a man proposing nothing more controversial than a scheduling adjustment. Every sentence was precisely crafted. Every clause referenced existing legal precedent. The architecture was Hale's best work, elegant, defensible, and designed to transfer power so gradually that no single step would trigger alarm. Kalin looked up from the document and met Hale's eyes. The Chancellor held the gaze. Steady, professional. The eyes of a man who believed his strategy was invisible and his position was secure. "This proposal requires further review," Kalin said. "I am tabling it for 1 week." "Of course, Your Grace. Prudence in regulatory matters is always advisable." Advisable. The word hung in the air with the specific aftertaste of condescension that powerful men deployed when they believed they were managing someone who did not understand the game being played. Hale thought he was managing Kalin. He thought the dissolution had fractured the Duke's attention. He thought the tabling was delay, not strategy. After the session, Kalin crossed the courtyard to the eastern tower. He climbed the stairs without sending word ahead, without requesting an audience, without the procedural formality that had governed every interaction in this castle for 19 years. He knocked on Seraphine's door the way a man knocks when he has run out of protocols and has nothing left except the raw, unmediated act of asking to be let in. Marin opened the door. Her expression shifted through surprise into assessment, into something that looked, for a fraction of a second, like the beginning of respect. She stepped aside without announcement. Seraphine was at her writing desk, reviewing documents. She looked up and saw him standing in her doorway, breathing slightly harder than a 3-flight staircase warranted, holding a copy of Hale's emergency provisions with the specific grip of a man holding evidence of his own institutional failure. "He moved," Kalin said. She set down her pen. "Show me." He crossed the room and placed the document on her desk. She read it standing, the way she had read the dissolution papers, line by line, clause by clause. Her finger traced the regulatory language the way a surgeon traces an incision line, identifying the precise points where the blade would enter. This gives the Chancellery control over all commercial waterways during trade disruptions, she said. Yes. And Voss's coalition is currently manufacturing trade disruptions along the river passage. Yes. So when the disruptions reach the threshold defined in Section 3, Hale invokes emergency authority, appoints Creston as regional administrator of the passage, and your own legal framework becomes the instrument that transfers control of my family's territory to your enemy. Yes, she set the document down. When does the Assembly vote? 1 week. I tabled it to buy time. 1 week is not enough. My father's documentation of the disruptions is incomplete. We have evidence of pattern, but not of coordination. Any individual incident can be explained as market fluctuation. We need Voss to connect himself publicly to the disruptions, and he is far too careful to do that voluntarily. Unless he believes the vote is guaranteed. Seraphine looked at him. The analytical machinery behind her eyes was running at full speed, processing variables, testing scenarios, discarding options that failed the test of operational reality. He recognized the process because it was identical to his own, and recognizing it produced a sensation he had no framework for. The disorienting experience of looking at another person and seeing not an asset or an obstacle or a piece of strategic furniture, but a mind that operated at the same frequency as his own. You want to leak false intelligence, she said. Make Voss believe he has the votes to pass the provision. Force him to accelerate his timeline. Push him into an overt act before his preparations are complete. It is the only way to collapse his operational security. If he believes victory is certain, he stops protecting his connections. He contacts his allies openly. He coordinates the final disruptions through channels we are already monitoring. And the risk? If we miscalculate, Voss passes the provision legitimately and takes legal control of the river passage before we can expose him. That is not a risk, Kaelin. That is a consequence. Risks have probabilities. This consequence is binary. We succeed or we lose everything. I know. She walked to the window. The courtyard below was empty in the late afternoon light. Shadows stretched long across cobblestones that had been worn smooth by 3 centuries of foot traffic, horse hooves, and the quiet, relentless passage of time that reduced every grand ambition to a pattern in stone. Do it, she said without turning from the window. Leak through Chamberlain Row, Voss's own information channel. Feed him assembly vote projections showing a comfortable majority in favor of the provision. Make Voss believe his victory is already secured. That exposes Rowe as our asset. Rowe is not our asset. Rowe is their asset who we have identified. There is a difference. Let him function. Let him carry the false intelligence to Voss the same way he carried the true intelligence about our dissolution. Voss trusts the channel. He will not question the content. Kaelin stood in Seraphine's tower room, surrounded by the evidence of a life she had built inside the space his system had allocated to her. Books stacked on every surface, maps pinned to walls that were meant to display tapestries, correspondence organized in a filing system more sophisticated than anything his chancellery used. She had constructed an operational intelligence center inside a suite designed to be a gilded cage, and she had done it so quietly that no one in the castle, including the man who believed he monitored everything, had detected it. You have been preparing for something like this, he said. It was not a question. I have been preparing for whatever came next. In a castle where I had no authority and no allies, preparation was the only form of power available to me. You had an ally, you simply did not know it. I still do not know it, Kaelin. I know a man who is currently behaving differently than he has for 18 months. Whether that is transformation or tactics remains to be determined. He absorbed that without flinching. She was right to withhold trust. She was right to evaluate him the way he evaluated everyone, through sustained observation rather than declared intention. She was holding him to the same standard he had applied to every person in his life, and the fact that it felt like standing on a knife's edge rather than sitting in a position of authority was itself the measure of how far his internal landscape had shifted. Garrick will coordinate the leak tonight, Kaelin said. Rowe will receive the false projections through a channel that appears to originate from the Assembly's internal tallying office. If Voss accelerates as predicted, we will see movement within 48 hours. And Hale? Hale continues to believe he is invisible. When the moment comes, I will handle Hale myself. How? He moved toward the door. At the threshold he stopped. The same threshold where Seraphine had paused 2 nights before this story began, where she had said thank you and walked into a corridor without looking back. He stood in the same position, facing the opposite direction, and felt the architectural symmetry of the moment with the physical awareness of a man who had spent his life inside structures designed to communicate power through geometry. By telling him the truth, Kaelin said, every person in this castle has been operating beneath my attention because my attention was pointed in the wrong direction. Hale did not betray me because he is disloyal. He betrayed me because I built a system where loyalty was irrelevant and efficiency was the only currency. He found a more efficient employer. I cannot punish him for responding rationally to the incentives I created. That is the most dangerous thing you have ever said. Why? Because it means you are about to fight the most important battle of your reign while simultaneously dismantling the instincts that have won every battle before it. You are going into combat without your best weapon. My best weapon was always fear, and fear is what created every enemy currently trying to destroy me. If I use it again, I survive today and build tomorrow's conspiracy myself. That cycle ends here. He left her room and descended the stairs. His boots struck limestone with a rhythm that was different from the one the kitchen staff had memorized, slightly faster, slightly harder. The cadence of a man who was no longer walking through his castle, but running toward a confrontation he could not fully predict and could not afford to lose. The leak went out through Row that night. 41 hours later, Garrick intercepted 3 messages simultaneously. Voss to Creston, confirming the final disruption schedule along the river passage. Voss to 2 assembly ministers Kaelin had not previously identified as compromised, Lord Fenwick and Baron Aldane, coordinating their votes for the emergency provisions. And Hale to Voss directly, for the first time without intermediary, providing the final draft of the provision with annotations indicating which clauses had been specifically designed to survive legal challenge. The conspiracy was fully exposed. Every participant, every communication, every financial transaction, every piece of legal architecture designed to transfer the river passage from Vale control to Voss's coalition. Kaelin held the evidence in his hands, standing in the tactical study at 3 a.m, and felt the weight of a choice that would define everything that followed. He had enough to destroy them. Every name, every document, every coded message. He could convene an emergency session, present the evidence, invoke sovereign authority, arrest Hale and Voss, strip Creston and Fenwick and Aldane of their titles, and reassert his control over the duchy through the same machinery of fear and institutional violence that had maintained his power for 19 years. Or he could do what Seraphine had described. Let them believe they were winning. Let them walk into the assembly chamber for the vote. Let them cast their ballots in full confidence that their conspiracy had succeeded. And then, in front of every minister and noble in Blackthorn, lay the evidence on the table and let them face not the Duke's punishment, but their own exposure. One approach used power, the other used truth. And the distance between those 2 options was the distance between the man Kaelin had been and the man he was trying to become. Dawn was 40 minutes away. The assembly vote was scheduled for tomorrow. Every piece was in position. Every conspirator was committed. Every exit was sealed. And in the Eastern Tower, a woman who had spent 18 months studying the architecture of control from the inside was about to discover whether the man who built it was capable of tearing it down with his own hands while standing inside it. Kaelin set the evidence on the table. He pressed both palms flat against the wood. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the Duke of Blackthorn picked up the documents and walked toward a door he could not see beyond. The assembly chamber filled slowly on the morning of the vote. Ministers arrived in the order that their confidence dictated, the most secure taking their seats early with the relaxed posture of men who believed the outcome was already decided, the uncertain filtering in later with the careful movements of people who understood that today's session would rearrange the political furniture in ways that could not be undone. Aldrich Voss arrived third. He wore a charcoal coat with silver thread at the cuffs, understated enough to project humility, expensive enough to signal that humility was a choice rather than a condition. He exchanged brief greetings with Lord Fenwick and Baron Aldane as he passed their chairs, the kind of minimal eye contact that communicated alignment without advertising it. 3 men who had rehearsed the choreography of appearing uncoordinated, Chancellor Braden Hale arrived fifth, carrying his leather portfolio and wearing the professionally neutral expression that had served him for 11 years. He took his seat to the left of the Duke's chair and arranged his papers with the same methodical precision that Kaelin had once trusted, and now read as the meticulous grooming of a man who understood that surfaces mattered more than structures when the structure was already hollowed. Seraphine entered the chamber 6 minutes before the session was scheduled to begin. She had never attended an assembly session. The Duchess held no formal role in Blackthorn's governing structure, a fact that the chamber's architecture reinforced with silent eloquence. There was no seat designated for her, no position allocated, no space within the semicircle of carved wooden chairs that acknowledged her existence as anything other than a title attached to the Duke's name. She walked to the gallery above the chamber floor, the elevated viewing area where observers and petitioners sat during public sessions, and took a seat in the front row. Her presence registered among the ministers the way a change in atmospheric pressure registers among sailors. No one commented. Everyone noticed. Voss glanced up at her. His expression did not change, but his left hand, resting on his knee, shifted position. A micro-adjustment that meant nothing to anyone who was not specifically watching for signs that Aldrich Voss's confidence had been disrupted by an unexpected variable. Garrick was watching. Garrick noted the hand. Kaelin entered last. He descended the 3 steps to his elevated chair with the measured stride that the castle had synchronized itself around for 19 years. He sat. He placed both hands flat on the armrests. He surveyed the chamber with the panoramic attention of a man who had spent his entire career reading rooms the way tacticians read battlefields, identifying positions, assessing strengths, cataloging vulnerabilities. Today the room read differently. Not because the room had changed, but because his eyes had. Every chair, every face, every carefully managed expression contained information that his previous mode of perception had been designed to miss. He had spent 19 years looking for threats. Today he looked for people. The distinction was subtle and total. The Assembly will address one item this session, Kaelin said. The emergency economic stabilization provisions submitted by Chancellor Hale. Before we proceed to a vote, I have a statement. Hale's fingers tightened on his portfolio. The movement was fractional, involuntary, the kind of physical tell that the body produces when the mind encounters a variable it has not modeled. A statement before the vote was not part of the procedure. Statements before votes were the Duke's prerogative, but Kaelin had not exercised that prerogative in 7 years. Its sudden resurrection introduced uncertainty into a timeline that Hale had engineered to proceed without interruption. Kaelin reached beneath his chair and produced a leather case that Garrick had placed there an hour earlier. He opened it and removed a stack of documents, 37 pages in total, organized chronologically and annotated in Garrick's precise handwriting. Over the past 11 days, my office has conducted a comprehensive review of communications and financial transactions related to the proposed stabilization provisions. This review was initiated following the interception of coded correspondence between Minister Voss and Lord Hale Creston, whose estate borders the Vale River Passage. The chamber's temperature changed, not physically, psychologically. The specific thermal shift that occurs when a room full of political professionals simultaneously realizes that the ground beneath their calculations has been removed. Voss did not move. His training was better than that, but the color in his face redistributed, draining from the surface and concentrating somewhere deeper, somewhere that external observation could not reach, but internal experience could not ignore. The blood leaving a man's face was not fear. It was the body's recognition that the environment had just become survival-level hostile, and resources needed to be redirected from performance to preservation. The review has produced documented evidence of coordinated activity between Minister Voss, Lord Creston, Lord Fenwick, Baron Aldane, and Chancellor Hale. This activity includes the deliberate disruption of commercial traffic along the Vale River Passage to manufacture the economic instability that the proposed provisions are designed to address. In simple terms, the crisis that this legislation claims to solve was engineered by the people proposing the legislation. Kaelin set the first document on the table, then the second, then the third. He placed each one with deliberate, unhurried precision, building a physical structure of evidence that grew on the table the way a case grows in a courtroom, piece by piece, each addition strengthening the architecture of the whole. Correspondence from Minister Voss to Lord Creston, dated 6 weeks ago, outlining a schedule for cargo disruptions along the passage's northern corridor. Financial records showing payments from Voss's household accounts to 3 cargo licensing officials along the passage, totaling amounts sufficient to incentivize the tariff increases documented by Vale family administrators. And this, he placed the final document on top. A direct communication from Chancellor Hale to Minister Voss, providing the final draft of the emergency provisions with annotations identifying which clauses were designed to survive legal challenge. Written in Hale's hand, sealed with his personal cipher. Hale stared at the document. His face had achieved the specific pallor of a man watching his own signature become the instrument of his destruction. 11 years of service. 11 years of precision, discretion, and the carefully maintained appearance of loyalty. All of it collapsing into a single page of handwritten notes that he had believed would never be read by anyone except its intended recipient. "Chancellor Hale," Kalin said. His voice carried the chamber without force. It did not need force. The evidence was the force. "Would you like to address the assembly?" The silence that followed was not the silence of a room waiting for a response. It was the silence of a room watching a man's options close around him like walls in a corridor that had no exit. Hale could deny. The evidence was in his handwriting. He could claim coercion. No evidence of coercion existed. He could remain silent. Silence in this context was confession. Hale stood. He closed his portfolio. He placed both hands on the table in front of him, palms down, fingers spread, and looked at Kalin with the expression of a man who had run every calculation available to him and arrived at a number that could not be spent. "I served this duchy faithfully for 11 years, Hale said. His voice was steady. The steadiness was not composure. It was the rigidity of a structure that has absorbed all the stress it can hold and is now simply waiting for the additional gram that initiates collapse. I administered your legal framework, I drafted your treaties, I prepared your marriage compact and your dissolution papers. I performed every function you assigned with the precision you demanded. Yes, you did. And in 11 years, you never once asked me whether I believed in any of it, whether I thought the system I administered was just, whether the laws I drafted served the duchy or only served the duke. You measured my value by my output, and when a better market for my output appeared, you are surprised that I responded to the incentive." The words landed in the chamber with the weight of a confession that was also an indictment. Hale was not defending himself. He was diagnosing the system that had produced his betrayal, and the diagnosis was accurate enough that several ministers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, recognizing in Hale's words a description of their own relationship with the Duke's authority. Kalin heard it, all of it, not just the words, but the structure beneath them, the load-bearing truth that Hale had identified with the same analytical precision he had brought to every legal instrument he had ever drafted. The system had failed, not because it was corrupt, but because it was empty. It measured compliance and ignored conviction. It rewarded efficiency and never asked whether efficiency was pointed in the right direction. It produced obedience and called it loyalty, and when the obedience found a more profitable employer, the system had no mechanism for understanding why. "You are correct," Kalin said. The chamber went still. Not the productive stillness of a room processing information, the stunned stillness of a room hearing its ruler say something that rulers did not say. Rulers did not agree with the people who betrayed them. Rulers did not validate the grievances of traitors. Rulers punished, and punishment was the mechanism that maintained the system, and the system was the mechanism that maintained the ruler. I built a governance structure that treated every person in this duchy as a function rather than a participant. I measured loyalty by compliance and confused control with leadership. Chancellor Hale exploited a flaw in my system, and the flaw was that the system did not deserve the loyalty it demanded. He stood. Not aggressively, not with the coiled physical authority that he had used for 19 years to remind every room that its center of gravity answered to him. He stood the way a man stands when he has decided to be visible rather than dominant, and the distinction changed the geometry of the entire chamber. That failure is mine. The conspiracy is yours. These are separate accountings, and both will be addressed. He turned to Garrick. Chancellor Hale is relieved of his position effective immediately. Minister Voss, Lord Fenwick, and Baron Aldane are suspended from the Assembly pending a formal review of the evidence. Lord Creston's territorial privileges along the passage border are frozen until the review is complete. And the provisions? Garrick asked. Withdrawn permanently. Kaelin looked at the document stack on the table. 37 pages of evidence that represented not just a conspiracy, but a complete failure of the philosophy he had spent his adult life perfecting. This assembly will reconvene in 1 week to discuss structural reforms to Blackthorn's governance. Not the kind of reform Minister Voss proposed, which was designed to redistribute power from one set of hands to another. Reform that addresses the foundational question this conspiracy has forced me to confront. Which question, Your Grace? The voice came from Lord Marin, a senior minister who had sat through the entire proceeding with the quiet attentiveness of a man who had been waiting a very long time for this particular conversation. Whether authority that must be enforced through control was ever authority at all, or whether it was simply force that lasted long enough to forget its own name. The session adjourned. Ministers filed out in the specific silence that follows events that will be discussed for decades. Some walked quickly, eager to process what they had witnessed in private. Others walked slowly, carrying the weight of recognition that the political landscape they had navigated for years had just been fundamentally redrawn. Voss left under guard escort. His face had settled into the flat, effectless expression of a man who had already begun the internal process of recalculating his position from the new coordinates. He was not broken. Men like Voss were not built to break. They were built to adapt, to find the next angle, to survive the current disaster and position themselves for the next opportunity. But the next opportunity would not arrive inside Blackthorn's assembly. His titles would survive the review. His influence would not. Hale walked out alone. No guard escort. Kaelin had not ordered one, and the omission was deliberate. Hale was not a prisoner. He was a man whose employment had been terminated for cause, and treating him as a criminal would have contradicted everything Kaelin had just said about the system that produced him. Hale passed through the chamber door and disappeared into the corridor, and the sound of his footsteps fading into stone was the sound of 11 years of service concluding with the quiet, unremarkable finality that most endings actually produce when they are not being narrated for dramatic effect. Seraphine remained in the gallery after the chamber emptied. She sat in the front row of a viewing area designed for observers, not participants, and watched Kaelin standing alone on the chamber floor below. The geometric light patterns from the high windows fell across his shoulders in the same sharp lines they had always produced, but the man inside the light had shifted his relationship with the architecture that contained him. He was no longer using the room. He was standing in it, present rather than presiding, occupying space rather than commanding it. She descended the gallery stairs and crossed the chamber floor. Her footsteps echoed in the empty room with the clean, unadorned acoustics that stone chambers produced when they were no longer filled with the sounds of political performance. "You told him he was right," she said. "He was right. That cost you something. It cost me the version of myself that could not hear accurate criticism from a man I should have listened to years ago. That version was expensive to maintain and produced diminishing returns." He looked at her. "You stayed?" "I stayed to protect my family's territory. That objective has been accomplished." "And now?" She stood 3 feet from him. The distance was neither intimate nor formal. It was the distance that two people maintain when they are no longer performing their designated roles and have not yet determined what occupies the space between them without those roles as scaffolding. "Now I have a choice that belongs to me for the first time since I entered this castle. I can return to the Vale estate. The dissolution papers are signed. My legal independence is restored. My family's territory is secured. There is nothing keeping me here except the question of whether I want to be here." "And do you?" "I do not know yet, and that uncertainty is more honest than any answer I could give you right now." She paused. The pause was not hesitation. It was the careful, deliberate selection of words by a woman who understood that the next sentence would establish the terms of whatever existed between them going forward. "I'm going to stay in this castle for 30 days, not as the Duchess, not as your wife, as Seraphine Vale, occupying the Eastern Tower Suite as a guest of the duchy while I determine whether the man who stood in this chamber today is the same man who will be standing here in a month. 30 days. 30 days during which you will govern this duchy through the reforms you promised. 30 days during which I will observe whether the system you build next treats the people inside it as participants or possessions. 30 days during which neither of us pretends that what happened in the last week has resolved anything except the immediate crisis. That is a probationary period. Yes, for both of us. You are learning whether you can sustain what you started today. I am learning whether I can trust what I am seeing. Neither of those questions has an answer yet. Kaelin looked at her for a long time. The chamber was empty. The light moved slowly across the stone floor. The castle breathed around them with the deep, patient rhythm of a structure that had survived 3 centuries of ambition, failure, reinvention, and the quiet, persistent human need to build something that outlasted the builder. 30 days, he said. Agreed. She extended her hand, not for a handshake, which would have been transactional, not for an embrace, which would have been premature. She held her hand out, palm up, open, in a gesture that offered nothing except the willingness to be met without knowing what meeting would produce. He looked at her hand. He understood what it cost her to offer it. 18 months of silence, isolation, and the systematic reduction of her identity to a decorative function had not destroyed her capacity for openness. It had refined it. She was not offering vulnerability. She was offering the distilled, battle-tested version of trust that only people who have survived its absence can produce. He placed his hand in hers. Not gripping, not possessing, resting. The way a man rests his hand on a surface when he has finally stopped reaching for something to hold on to. They stood that way for 3 seconds. Then she withdrew her hand, turned, and walked toward the chamber door. At the threshold she paused, and the architecture of the moment echoed through every interaction they had shared in doorways and on thresholds since the night this story began. Kaelin? Yes. The stationery I requested, with both crests. I would like new sheets printed, same paper, same weight, but this time the Vale crest and the Ashbourne crest at the same height. He almost smiled. It was not a full smile. It was the muscular precursor to a smile, the involuntary activation of tissue in a face that had spent decades practicing immobility. It lived for less than a second before his training suppressed it. But it existed, and she saw it. I will have Garrick arrange it, he said. She left. The door closed. And Kaelin Ashbourne stood alone in the assembly chamber of Blackthorn Castle, in the room where he had governed an empire through control and fear, and the absolute conviction that vulnerability was the only weakness a ruler could not survive. He had survived it, not gracefully, not completely, not with the clean, decisive resolution that stories demanded from powerful men who confronted their own failures. He had survived it the way actual human beings survived actual transformation, messily, incompletely, with the uncomfortable awareness that the work was not finished and might never be finished, and that the willingness to continue was itself the only metric that mattered. He walked to the tall window behind his chair and looked down at the courtyard. The castle's daily commerce flowed in patterns he had memorized decades ago. Stable hands leading horses, kitchen staff receiving deliveries, the gardener trimming hedges along the southern wall with the slow, devoted attention of someone whose entire world measured 6 feet wide and 40 feet long. The gardener looked up. Their eyes met. And Kaelin did something he had never done in 19 years of looking down at this courtyard from this window. He nodded. The gardener blinked, surprised, then nodded back, then returned to the hedges. A moment of mutual acknowledgement that lasted less than 2 seconds and contained no strategic value whatsoever. A man in a window seeing a man in a garden and communicating, through the simplest human gesture available, that both of them existed in the same world and that the existence of one did not diminish the existence of the other. Kaelin turned from the window. The chamber waited behind him, empty and silent and full of the residual energy of everything that had transpired within its walls. He crossed the floor, climbed the 3 steps to his chair, and sat down. Not to preside, not to govern, just to sit in a room that had witnessed his authority at its most absolute and his humanity at its most exposed, and to feel both of those things simultaneously without choosing between them. The reforms would take months. The political landscape would resist and adapt and test every new structure he attempted to build. Voss would eventually return to relevance in some diminished capacity, because men like Voss were a permanent feature of any system that involved human ambition. The river passage would require renegotiation, proper renegotiation, conducted between the Vale family and Blackthorn's new chancellery on terms that treated partnership as a mutual investment rather than a unilateral acquisition. And Seraphine would spend 30 days watching, evaluating, deciding, not whether the Duke of Blackthorn deserved her presence, because deserve was a word that belonged to the old system, the system that calculated human relationships as transactions with measurable returns. She would decide whether the man inside the Duke was someone she could build something with, something that had no guarantee, no contract, no withdrawal clause, no safety net except the shared willingness to remain honest with each other even when honesty was the most expensive option available. He did not know what she would decide. The uncertainty was excruciating and necessary, and for the first time in his life, something he did not attempt to resolve through control. Outside the castle walls, the duchy stretched toward horizons he could not see from this window. Villages and farmland and river passages and trade routes and hundreds of thousands of lives that would be affected by whatever he built next. He had governed them through fear, and fear had produced obedience, and obedience had produced a kingdom that looked magnificent from the outside and was rotting from within. What replaced fear was not its opposite. It was not softness or sentimentality or the abdication of authority that weak men called compassion when they lacked the courage to make difficult decisions. What replaced fear was the harder, slower, less dramatic work of earning the thing that fear only simulated. Trust. Not the strategic deployment of trust as a tool, not the conditional extension of trust as a test, the actual, irreversible, operationally terrifying act of trusting other people to participate in their own governance, trusting a woman to decide her own future, trusting a duchy to function through consent rather than compliance, trusting himself to lead without the safety net of absolute control. The Iron Duke still ruled Blackthorn. His authority remained intact. His strategic mind still operated with the precision that had made him the most formidable political figure on the continent. Nothing about his capability had diminished. What had changed was the purpose his capability served. He had spent 19 years building a machine that ran on fear. Now he sat in the machine's central chamber and began, slowly, imperfectly, with the full knowledge that failure was possible and success was not guaranteed, the work of converting its engine from fear to something that did not yet have a name in his vocabulary, but that he recognized by its effect. It was the thing that made Seraphine extend her hand, palm up in an empty room. The thing that made a gardener nod back at a duke who had never acknowledged him. The thing that existed in the space between control and chaos, in the territory that no map in his tactical study had ever charted because it could not be conquered, only entered. He sat in the chair. The light moved. The castle breathed. Somewhere in the eastern tower, Seraphine Vale opened her desk drawer and removed the unfinished letter to her father. She read the 4 words she had written days ago. "It is done, Father." She picked up her pen, considered the sentence for a moment, then added 3 more words beneath it. "Something is beginning." She folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it in Marin's hands for delivery. Then she returned to the window that overlooked the courtyard of a castle she had entered as a transaction and might, if 30 days produced what she suspected they would produce, choose to inhabit as a home. The great castle stood. Its stone towers caught the afternoon light and held it the way old structures hold everything, patiently, without urgency, with the quiet confidence of something that has survived long enough to know that the most important things are never built quickly. Inside its walls, a man who had mistaken possession for devotion sat alone with the knowledge that devotion could not be designed, only earned. And in a tower above him, a woman who had mistaken departure for freedom sat with the knowledge that freedom meant nothing if it was only used to leave, and everything if it was used to choose. Neither of them knew what would happen next. That was the point. That was the entire terrifying, necessary point. The story of the Iron Duke and the woman who walked away from his empire does not end with conquest or surrender. It ends with 2 people sitting in separate rooms of the same castle, both aware that the walls between them are thinner than they have ever been, both unwilling to pretend that thin walls are the same as open doors, and both choosing, independently, voluntarily, without contract or coercion, or the comfortable certainty that the outcome was guaranteed to remain. Not because they had to, because they decided to. And that decision, fragile and unfinished and more honest than anything either of them had ever built, was the first foundation that deserved to stand.